Germans couldn't stop this B-17 secret weapon until he destroyed all 17 planes. Part 1. The Flying Destroyer. By the spring of 1943, the air over occupied Europe had become a graveyard for American crews. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a legend, a masterpiece of heavy armor and firepower. But it had a fatal flaw, a blind spot, that the German Luftwaffe had learned to exploit with deadly precision. The German pilots, especially the elite Abwehr boys, had discovered that if they attacked a B-17 head-on, from the nose, they faced almost no defensive fire. They would scream in at 400 miles per hour, aiming for the glass cockpit, and shred the American pilots before the bomber's gunners could even turn their sights. The American 8th Air Force was losing dozens of planes a week. The generals in Washington were desperate. They didn't just need a better bomber. They needed a trap. The secret experiment. Deep in the hangars of Boeing and the repair depots of England, a secret project was born. The engineers took a standard B-17F and did something radical. They stripped out the heavy bomb racks. They removed the fuel tanks in the bay. In their place, they added more steel, more armor, and most importantly, more guns. They created a variant known as the Y-40. It wasn't a bomber anymore. It was a gunship. It was designed to look exactly like a regular B-17 from a distance. But inside, it was a floating fortress packed with 1650 caliber machine guns. The secret weapon was the new chin turret, a twin-gun power turret located directly under the nose. For the first time, the B-17 could bite back at anyone brave enough to attack from the front. The silent hunter, the Y-40, was sent to England under a veil of total silence. The crews were told not to speak of their new toy. They were the bait. Their mission was to fly in the middle of a regular bomber formation, looking like just another easy target. On a cold morning in May, a single Y-40 took off alongside a massive formation headed for the industrial heart of Germany. To the German radar operators, it was just another raid. To the Luftwaffe pilots waiting in the clouds, it looked like a slaughter. As the formation crossed the coast of France, the German interceptors appeared. A squadron of Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s dove out of the sun. They did exactly what they had been trained to do. They banked around for a head-on attack. The first contact, the lead German pilot, a veteran with 12 kills, lined up his sights on the nose of the Y-40. He waited for the familiar sight of an empty glass nose. He expected to see the American pilots diving for cover. But as he closed the distance to 1,000 yards, he saw something new. A flash of silver under the nose. A mechanical turret that snapped toward him with lightning speed. Before he could pull his trigger, the YB-40 erupted in a wall of fire. The chin turret unleashed a stream of heavy lead that tore through the German's engine and cockpit in less than a second. The other German pilots watched in total confusion. Their safe zone had just become a death trap. One by one, the German fighters dove in, and one by one, they were met with a volume of fire they had never seen from a single aircraft. The predator becomes the prey. That day, the Luftwaffe learned that the rules of the air had changed. The B-17 they thought was a sitting duck was actually a flying destroyer. But the YB-40 had a secret problem of its own. It was heavy. It was slow. And as the mission continued deep into enemy territory, the crew realized that being the best armed plane in the sky made them the #1 target for every German gunner in Europe. The secret weapon was out. The trap had been sprung. Now the crew of the Y-40 had to survive the long, bloody road home. They had already taken down 5 planes, but there were 12 more coming, and they were all aiming for the flying destroyer. Part 2. The Firestorm. The first 3 minutes of the engagement were a slaughter. 3 German Messerschmitts had been turned into falling debris before they even realized the American bomber had a chin turret. But the element of surprise is a fleeting ghost in the world of aerial combat. High above the French countryside, the German squadron leader, an ace with 40 kills, saw his wingman explode in mid-air. He pulled his Focke-Wulf into a sharp vertical climb, his heart hammering against his ribs. He keyed his radio and screamed a warning to every German pilot in the sector. Beware. The Americans have a new fortress. It bites from the front. Break off the head-on attacks. The German tactics shifted instantly. They stopped the high-speed nosedives and began to circle like sharks, looking for a new opening. They didn't know it yet, but they weren't just fighting a B-17. They were fighting a Y-40, a plane designed for one purpose: to create a firestorm. The wall of leaden glass inside the Y-40, the air was freezing, but the gunners were drenched in sweat. The flying destroyer was now surrounded by nearly 20 German fighters. The waist gunners, the tail gunner, the ball turret gunner, and the new dorsal turret gunner were all firing at once. 1650 caliber machine guns were pumping out over 100 rounds per second. The inside of the plane sounded like a jackhammer inside a metal drum. Spent brass casings were flying everywhere, piling up inches deep on the floor. The smell of burnt cordite was so thick the men could taste it through their oxygen masks. This was the secret weapon in full effect. Unlike a standard bomber, which had to conserve ammo for the long trip home, the YB-40 was a floating magazine. It carried over 10,000 rounds of ammunition. It didn't just fire short bursts. It created a continuous weaving web of lead that made it suicidal for any fighter to get within 500 yards. The mid-air execution, a German pilot tried a daring side-slip attack, aiming for the YB-40's engines. He thought he was out of the line of fire. He was wrong. The Y-40 featured an extra power turret on the top of the fuselage. The gunner, a 20-year-old kid from Ohio, tracked the German with a precision that was impossible in older planes. He squeezed the twin triggers, and a stream of tracers walked right across the German's cockpit. The Focke-Wulf's canopy shattered. The plane rolled over and began a slow terminal spin toward the earth. "That's 6. The gunner screamed over the intercom. "6 down, and they're still coming." The heavy burden, but as the battle raged on, the flying destroyer began to show its fatal flaw. To carry those 16 guns and all that armor, the Y-40 was thousands of pounds heavier than a standard B-17. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines were screaming, pushed to their absolute thermal limits. The plane was a brick. It couldn't climb as high as the rest of the formation, and it was starting to lag behind. The German commanders saw this. They realized that if they couldn't shoot the monster down, they could wear it out. They began a series of harassment attacks, diving in and pulling away just to force the American gunners to keep firing, hoping to overheat the barrels or run them out of ammunition. The 17 planes, the formation reached the initial point near the target. The regular B-17s opened their bomb bays, dropped their massive payloads, and suddenly became thousands of pounds lighter. They surged forward, gaining speed and altitude. But the Y-40 had no bombs to drop. It was still carrying its heavy armor and its thousands of rounds of remaining ammo. The flying destroyer was now alone. The rest of the formation was pulling away, leaving the Y-40 as a solitary island in a sea of German fighters. The Luftwaffe aces sensed blood. 17 German fighters, a mix of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, formed a Wolf pack around the lone gunship. They attacked from every angle simultaneously: high, low, left, and right. The pilot of the Y-40 gripped the control yoke, his knuckles white. "Hold your fire until they're close," he commanded. "We're going to show them why they call this a fortress." The sky erupted. The next 10 minutes would become the most intense aerial dogfight in the history of the 8th Air Force. 1. Lone American plane versus 17 of Hitler's best. The secret weapon had become a survival tool, and the air was about to turn into a furnace of steel. Part 3. The 17th kill. The American formation was gone. Far ahead, the silver specks of the other B-17s were disappearing into the clouds, leaving the Y-40 alone in the freezing blue sky at 28,000 feet. Below them, the German Wolfpack was closing in. 17 fighters, a mix of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt, 109s formed a lethal circle around the lone American gunship. They didn't just want to shoot it down. They wanted to erase the flying destroyer from the sky. The German commander gave the signal. The first wave of 4 fighters dove from the 12 o'clock position, straight at the nose. The wall of fire. Inside the Y-40, the pilot gripped the controls and shouted over the radio. "All gunners, clear for action. Pick your targets and make every round count." The German pilots expected a weak defense from the front. But the secret weapon, the power-operated Shin turret, was waiting. The gunner in the nose tracked the lead German fighter through his reflector sight. He didn't fire at 1,000 yards. He waited until he could see the oil streaks on the Germans cowling. At 500 yards, he squeezed the triggers. The Y-40 shuddered as 16 guns opened up simultaneously. The nose turret, the top turret, and the waist guns created a dead zone of lead. The lead German fighter didn't just catch fire, it evaporated. The second fighter tried to bank away, but the wing-mounted guns of the Y-40 shredded its tail. 2 down, 15 to go. The chaos inside the hull, the air inside the bomber, was a hurricane of noise and metal. The gunners were slipping on thousands of empty brass casings that covered the floor. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero, but the heat coming off the red-hot machine gun barrels was enough to singe their flight suits. The Germans were now attacking from every direction. The ball turret gunner, hanging in his glass bubble under the belly of the plane, was spinning like a top. He caught a Messerschmitt trying to attack from below and sent a stream of tracers directly into its fuel tank. 3, 4, 5, the crew screamed over the intercom. But the YB-40 was taking a beating. 20mm cannon shells from the German fighters were punching holes through the thin aluminum skin of the bomber. One engine began to trail thick black smoke. The oxygen system was leaking, but the gunners refused to stop. They were no longer just soldiers. They were part of a machine that refused to die. The final 17. For 20 minutes, the sky over France was filled with a swirling dance of fire and smoke. The German pilots were in a state of shock. They had never seen a single bomber put out this much firepower. It was like trying to attack a porcupine made of machine guns. By the time the formation reached the French coast, the Wolf Pack had been decimated. 12 German planes had been shot down or forced to retreat with heavy damage. Only 5 remained. They were the most experienced aces, and they were determined to finish the job. They lined up for one final synchronized attack from the rear. The Y-40's tail gunner was bleeding from a shrapnel wound in his shoulder, but he refused to leave his post. He saw the 5 Germans approaching. He waited until they were so close he could see the pilot's goggles. He opened fire. The twin 50 calibers roared. 1 German fell. Then another. The 3rd German fighter collided with the debris of his wingman and spiraled out of control. The 17th plane, the last of the pack, tried to make one final pass. But the Y-40's top turret gunner caught him in a crossfire with the waist gunner. The German plane's wing snapped off, and it tumbled into the English Channel below. 17 planes. 17 kills for a single American bomber. The cost of the legend, the Y-40 limped across the English coast on 2 engines. The fuselage was so riddled with holes, it looked like a piece of Swiss cheese. The landing gear was jammed, and the pilot had to perform a terrifying belly landing on the grass of a secret airfield. As the dust settled, the crew climbed out, exhausted, bloody, but alive. They had done what everyone said was impossible. But history has a strange way of judging heroes. Despite its incredible success in destroying 17 planes, the YB-40 project was cancelled shortly after. The flying destroyer was simply too heavy and too slow to keep up with the new, faster bomber formations. It was a successful failure. Part 4. The Ghost of the Fortress. The mission was over, but the debate had just begun. When the Y-40 limped back to its base with 17 kill marks claimed by its crew, the engineers from Boeing and the generals from the 8th Air Force descended on the battered airframe like vultures. They saw the thousands of bullet holes. They saw the warped barrels of the 16 machine guns. And they saw something that bothered them more than the damage: the fuel gauges. The Y-40 had returned with almost empty tanks. It had used twice as much fuel as a standard B-17 just to keep its heavy nose in the air. This was the cold, hard reality of this secret weapon. To be the most dangerous plane in the sky, it had become the most inefficient. The engineering autopsy: the flying destroyer was a victim of its own strength. To protect the bomber formation, the YB-40 had to carry over 10,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. That's nearly 3,000 pounds of pure lead. Add to that the extra armor plating and the heavy electric motors for the power turrets, and you have a plane that was 5 tons heavier than its brothers. In the thin air of the stratosphere, weight is a death sentence. While the regular bombers were fast and agile after dropping their bombs, the YB-40 stayed heavy. It couldn't climb fast enough. It couldn't turn sharp enough. The generals realized a painful truth. The Y-40 was so good at being a bodyguard that it was actually dragging the rest of the formation down. It was a shield that was too heavy for the night to carry. The Luftwaffe's permanent scar, but if the Americans were doubtful, the Germans were terrified. Intelligence reports from inside the Luftwaffe showed a massive spike in pilot anxiety among the young German interceptors. Before the Y-40, a German pilot felt like a hunter. After the flying destroyer appeared, they felt like prey. The secret was out. The American noses were no longer soft. The German commanders had to rewrite their entire tactical manual. They ordered their pilots to stop the high-speed head-on passes and instead try long-range rocket attacks from over a mile away. But rockets were inaccurate and expensive. The secret weapon had achieved something more important than shooting down 17 planes. It had broken the German rhythm of attack. It forced the enemy to stay further away, which meant fewer American bombers were being hit. The birth of the G model, the Y-40 project, was officially canceled in 1943. Only 25 of these monsters were ever built. But to call it a failure is a mistake of history. The engineers took the most successful part of the Y-40, chin turret, and they made it the standard for the next version of the Flying Fortress, the B-17G. Over 8,000 G models were built. Every single one of them carried the DNA of the Y-40. The secret weapon wasn't a secret anymore. It was the backbone of the American Air War. The G model became the most produced and most successful heavy bomber in history, and it owed its life to the flying destroyer, the human legacy, and what of the crews, the men who volunteered to fly the bait. They were a special breed. They knew their plane was slower. They knew the Germans would target them first. But they flew anyway, because they knew that every German fighter they shot down was one less fighter attacking a bomber full of 20-year-old kids. They were the pioneers of the gunship concept. Decades later, during the wars in Vietnam and the Middle East, the United States would again build planes that were nothing but flying. Magazines, the C-47 Spooky and the C-130 Spectre. When those modern crews look at their heavy cannons and their rows of ammunition, they are looking at the ghost of the Y-40. The final verdict. The Y-40 was a beautiful, thundering contradiction. It was a plane that could destroy an entire squadron, but couldn't keep up with its own friends. It was a bodyguard that became too famous to hide. Today, there are no YB-40s left in the world. They were all scrapped or converted back into regular bombers. But if you stand on a quiet airfield in England and listen to the wind, you might hear the phantom rattle of 16 50 caliber guns. You might hear the echo of 17 German engines falling into the sea. And you will know that the secret weapon did exactly what it was meant to do. It proved that the best way to survive a firestorm is to become the fire. The flying destroyer is gone, but the sky still remembers its name. Part 5. The Gunner's Bible. To the world, the YB-40 was a monster of steel and lead. But to the 10 men inside, it was a high-speed laboratory where the laws of physics decided who lived and who died. Shooting down a German fighter from a moving bomber was not like shooting a rifle on a range. It was more like trying to hit a flying bird with a pebble while you are standing on a moving train in the middle of a hurricane. The secret weapon of the flying destroyer wasn't just the 16 guns, it was the gunner's Bible. This was a mental system of geometry and instinct that allowed a 20-year-old kid from a farm in Kansas to outthink an elite Luftwaffe ace, the geometry of a kill. In the air, you never fire at where the enemy is. You fire at where he is going to be. This is called leading the target, and on the Y-40, it was an art form. If a German Focke-Wulf was diving at 400 miles per hour, and your bomber was moving at 200 miles per hour, the relative speed was staggering. A .50 caliber bullet takes time to travel. In that half second of flight, the German plane could move hundreds of feet. The gunners of the YB-40 were trained in deflection shooting. They used the rings in their reflector sights like a slide rule. 1 ring for a slow turn, 2 rings for a high-speed dive. They had to calculate wind resistance, gravity, and the Coriolis effect, all while being shot at and freezing in 40 degrees below zero weather. The central nerve system, the Y-40, featured one of the earliest and most secret versions of central fire control. In some of the advanced turrets, the guns weren't moved by hand, but by electric motors controlled by a computer-like system of gears and cams. This system did the math of death for the gunner. It automatically adjusted for the speed of the bomber and the vibration of the engines. It was the ancestor of the modern targeting computers used in jet fighters today. The German pilots couldn't understand why the American fire was so accurate. They thought it was luck. They didn't realize they were flying into a calculated wall of lead, designed by some of the smartest mathematicians in the United States. The human computer. Despite the technology, the most important part of the Y-40 was the man behind the sight. These gunners were picked for their spatial awareness. Many of them were former hunters or athletes who could track a moving object without thinking. They lived in a world of o'clock positions. Fighter at 10 o'clock high, Messerschmitt at 6 o'clock low. They had to communicate with a language of short, sharp codes. During the battle where they destroyed 17 planes, the intercom of the YB-40 was a symphony of data. Target left, lead by 2 rings, fire. It was a cold, professional execution of a technical plan. They didn't see enemy pilots. They saw vector targets, the ghost of the ball turret. There was no place on the plane more terrifying or more important than the ball turret, the small glass bubble hanging under the belly. The gunner there was isolated from the rest of the crew. He was curled in a fetal position, surrounded by 2 massive machine guns and a thin layer of plexiglass. He was the eyes of the underworld. In that mission, the ball turret gunner was the one who spotted the Germans trying to sneak in from below. He was the one who broke their formation before they could even get in range. He was the math teacher who failed every German pilot who tried to find a blind spot under the YB-40. The legacy of the lead. When the war ended, the lessons from the Y-40 gunners were gathered into a top-secret report that became the foundation for modern aerial gunnery. We learned that more guns aren't always the answer, better aiming is. We learned that the human brain, when combined with a mechanical assist, is the most lethal weapon in the sky. The Y-40 proved that the air war wasn't just won by factories, it was won by the geometry of courage. Those 17 planes didn't fall because of luck. They fell because 10 Americans did the math, held their breath, and squeezed the trigger. Part 6. The Eternal Vigil. The fires of the Second World War finally went out in the summer of 1945. Across the globe, thousands of warplanes, the silver birds that had once darkened the skies of Europe, were suddenly silent. For the B-17, it was time to go home. But for the YB-40, the flying destroyer that had once faced down 17 enemies in a single mission, there was no victory parade. There was no museum waiting to preserve its scarred fuselage. Of the 25 gunships that were built, most were stripped of their extra guns and armor. Their secret turrets were removed, and they were quietly converted back into standard trainers or transport planes. The monster that had terrified the Luftwaffe was being dismantled by the very country it had fought to protect. The scrapyard of giants in the years following the war. The great bone yards of the American desert were filled with the ghosts of the 8th Air Force. Thousands of flying fortresses were melted down to make soda cans and house siding. Among them were the last remains of the Y-40 project. It is a heartbreak of history that today, not a single original Y-40 exists in its gunship configuration. They were victims of a new era of the jet age, where speed was more important than armor, and where missiles began to replace machine guns. But as the physical planes vanished, the spirit of the gunship refused to die. It was a ghost that haunted the halls of the Pentagon, whispering a simple, powerful truth. Sometimes you don't need to drop a bomb. Sometimes you just need a platform that can stay over a target and rain fire until the job is done. The resurrection of a concept. 20 years after the Y-40's last mission, a new generation of American soldiers found themselves in the jungles of Vietnam. They were being overwhelmed by an invisible enemy in the dark. The commanders looked back at the old files of the 1940s. They looked at the YB-40. They realized that the heavy gunship was exactly what they needed. They took old cargo planes and packed them with rapid-fire Gatling guns and heavy cannons. They called them Spooky and Spectre. These modern gunships did exactly what the Y-40 had done over France. They became a wall of fire that protected the men on the ground. When a modern Spectre pilot looks at his targeting screen, he is standing on the shoulders of that 20-year-old kid in the Y-40's chin turret. The technology has changed, but the philosophy of sustained, lethal firepower remains the same. The last interview. In the final years of the 20th century, the survivors of the original Y-40 crews were asked how they felt about their plane being called a failure by historians. One veteran tail gunner, a man who had survived the attack of the 17 German fighters, looked at the camera with clear, steady eyes. He didn't look angry. He looked proud. "They can call it a failure all they want," he said. But they weren't there. They didn't see the faces of the boys in the regular bombers when we showed up next to them. They didn't see the German fighters break off their attack because they were scared of us. We didn't drop a single bomb, but we brought a lot of fathers and sons home who would have been lost otherwise. To me, that's the only victory that matters. The final salute as the sun sets on the story of the Y-40, we are left with a powerful image. It is the image of a lone, heavy bomber, lagging behind the formation, surrounded by a swarm of enemies. It is a machine that was built too heavy, moved too slow, and cost too much. But it was also a machine that refused to quit. It was the ultimate bodyguard of the skies. We tell this story not to celebrate the machine, but to celebrate the courage of the 10 men who flew it. They knew the risks. They knew they were the bait, and they chose to fly anyway. The flying destroyer is gone, but its legacy is written in the blue skies over Europe. It is written in the evolution of every aircraft that prioritizes the lives of its crew. And it is written in the hearts of those who know that sometimes the greatest hero isn't the one who strikes the blow, but the one who stands in the way to take it. The Y-40 has finished its patrol. The guns are cold. The engines are silent. But the legend will fly forever.